November 12, 1944. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside Camp Longview, Texas, carrying 43 German women prisoners who had spent the last 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship. 24-year-old Lena Schneider stepped down onto American soil for the first time, her gray auxiliary uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 15 pounds since her capture in France 2 months earlier. The journey had been sustained on watery soup, stale bread, and the gnawing certainty that worse awaited them in the land of their enemies. The Texas sun beat down with an intensity that reminded Lena of nothing in her native Munich. Around her, the other women stood in uneven formation, their faces reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion, fear, and stubborn pride that had carried them through weeks of uncertainty. Hannah Becker, her closest companion since their deployment together in 1943, reached for Lena's hand, briefly before remembering they were under enemy observation. The gesture went unnoticed by the American guards, who seemed more interested in processing paperwork than intimidating their prisoners. Captain William Foster emerged from the administration building, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He addressed them through an interpreter, his words flat and bureaucratic, outlining camp rules and daily schedules. But Lena barely listened. Her attention had fixed on the building behind him, from which emerged the most unexpected scent she had encountered since her capture. Something was cooking. Not the thin cabbage soup or the tasteless porridge they had endured on the ship, but something rich, complex, layered with spices she couldn't identify. Her stomach clenched painfully at the aroma. Beside her, 19-year-old Sonia Werner swayed slightly, weakened by the journey and the heat. Ingrid Mueller, the oldest among them at 31 and a former nurse, steadied the girl with a firm grip. They had all learned to support each other during the crossing, when illness and despair had threatened to break their collective spirit. Now, standing in this strange Texas landscape with its flat horizons and impossible heat, that unity remained their only certainty. Lieutenant Emma Russell, one of the few female American officers they had encountered, approached with what appeared to be genuine concern. She spoke in careful, slow English that none of them fully understood, but her gestures toward the barracks were clear enough. They would be housed, given water, allowed to rest. It was more consideration than Lena had expected from the enemy, more humanity than she had been promised by the propaganda that had filled her years of service to the Reich. As they filed toward their assigned quarters, that cooking smell grew stronger, more insistent. Lena's mouth watered involuntarily, her body betraying the discipline she had maintained throughout her captivity. Whatever awaited them in this Texas camp, it had already challenged her first assumption about American cruelty. The enemy, it seemed, believed in feeding their prisoners. The question that haunted her as she entered the barracks was simple and terrifying. Why? The barracks were sparse but clean, a stark contrast to the cramped quarters aboard the transport ship. 43 women divided themselves among metal frame beds with thin mattresses that felt like luxury after weeks of sleeping on hard bunks in the cargo hold. Lena claimed a bed near the window, where she could see the camp's perimeter fence and the vast Texas landscape beyond. Hannah took the bed beside her, and together they sat in exhausted silence, too drained for conversation but too anxious for sleep. The afternoon heat pressed down on the building despite the open windows. Some of the younger women had already collapsed onto their beds, fully clothed, surrendering to exhaustion. But Ingrid Mueller moved among them with practiced efficiency, checking for signs of dehydration or illness, her nursing instincts overriding her own fatigue. She paused at Sonia's bed, placing a hand on the girl's forehead, then nodded with satisfaction. No fever, just exhaustion and hunger. At precisely 5 o'clock in the evening, a bell rang across the compound. The sound jolted Lena from the half-sleep she had fallen into, her military training bringing her immediately alert. Around her, the other women stirred, uncertain what this summons meant. Through the window, Lena could see American soldiers gathering near a large building she assumed was the mess hall. Her stomach twisted with anxiety and that treacherous hunger that refused to be disciplined away. Lieutenant Russell appeared at their barracks door, accompanied by a young guard who couldn't have been older than 20. Corporal Daniel Wright. His name tag read, and his face held none of the hardness Lena had been taught to expect from American soldiers. The lieutenant spoke in English, her tone matter-of-fact, while the young corporal attempted a clumsy translation in broken German that brought unintended humor to the moment. "Essen," he said, gesturing toward the mess hall. "Food. You come now." The women exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Was this the first meal in captivity, the beginning of the deprivation they had been warned about? Lena remembered the stories told by returned prisoners in Germany, tales of starvation rations and deliberate cruelty. Yet that smell from earlier still lingered in the air, rich and impossible to ignore. Slowly, they filed out of the barracks, maintaining their formation more from habit than from any order. As they approached the mess hall, Corporal Wright said something else in his awkward German, a phrase that made no sense to any of them. "Gebratnes Hähnchen." He tried, then gave up and simply said in English, "Fried chicken. Tonight, fried chicken." The words meant nothing to Lena. She knew Hähnchen meant chicken, but Gebraten, fried, in what way? She had eaten chicken in Munich, always boiled or roasted, usually reserved for special occasions. But this American preparation, this frying, was completely foreign to her understanding. Hannah leaned close and whispered, "What do you think it means?" Lena could only shake her head. Whatever awaited them inside that building, it bore no resemblance to anything in their experience. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty, for deprivation, for the harshness of enemy captivity. It had not prepared them for the possibility of being fed something called fried chicken, or for the way that simple announcement could shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew about their captors. The mess hall doors swung open, releasing a wave of heat and aroma that stopped Lena in her tracks. The other women crowded behind her, their formation dissolving as they caught their first glimpse of what awaited them inside. Long tables stretched across the room, and at each place setting sat a metal tray unlike anything Lena had seen in military service. On every tray rested 3 pieces of golden brown chicken, glistening with something that caught the overhead lights. Beside the chicken sat portions of mashed potatoes, green beans, and a small roll with butter. Lena's hands trembled as she stood frozen in the doorway. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of test, a psychological trick designed to break them down before revealing the true deprivation of captivity. Behind the serving counter stood a tall black man in an army uniform, his chef's apron spotless white against his dark skin. Sergeant Roland Jackson watched the German women's reactions with an expression that held neither hostility nor pity, just quiet observation. He had served these portions himself, she realized, had prepared this food with his own hands. Lieutenant Russell gestured for them to take their seats, her voice gentle but firm. The women moved like sleepwalkers, each finding a place at the tables, their eyes never leaving the trays before them. Lena sat slowly, Hannah sliding into the seat beside her. Across the table, young Sonia Werner stared at her portion with wide eyes that threatened tears. Ingrid Müller, seated at the end of the table, maintained her composure, but Lena could see the older woman's throat working as she swallowed hard. No one moved to eat. 43 women sat in absolute silence, confronting food that contradicted every expectation they had carried into this camp. The chicken pieces were enormous, far larger than the small portions Lena remembered from peacetime Munich. The skin had been cooked to a deep amber color, and up close, she could see the texture was different from any chicken preparation she knew. It looked crispy, almost crackling, and the smell that rose from it made her mouth water so intensely she had to press her lips together. Captain Foster stood at the front of the hall and spoke briefly. His interpreter, an older woman with kind eyes, translated, "You will eat now. This is your evening meal. Tomorrow you will receive breakfast at 0700 hours, lunch at 1200 hours, and dinner at 1700 hours. Every day. This is not a special occasion. This is standard." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible in their implications. Standard. Every day. Portions like this, every single day. Lena looked down at her tray, then at the fork in her hand. Her training, her pride, her entire understanding of her situation warred with the simple animal need to eat. Beside her, Hannah whispered in German, "Is this real?" Before Lena could answer, Ingrid Muller picked up her fork with deliberate dignity. "We eat," she said quietly in German, her voice carrying to the nearby tables. "We maintain our strength. We do not show weakness before the enemy." But when Ingrid cut into her first piece of chicken, when the fork pierced the crispy skin and revealed the white meat inside, her mask of composure cracked. Steam rose from the meat, carrying with it a scent of spices Lena couldn't name, pepper and paprika, and something else, something southern and distinctly American. Ingrid brought the fork to her mouth, chewed slowly, and her eyes closed. In that moment, Lena saw something she had never witnessed in the older woman's face during all their months of service and capture: surrender to something beyond duty or discipline. Lena watched Ingrid's expression transform and felt her own resolve crumbling. Around the mess hall, other women had begun to eat, their movements tentative at first, then increasingly urgent as hunger overrode caution. Hannah picked up her fork with shaking hands, cut a small piece from the chicken breast on her tray, and brought it to her lips. The moment she began to chew, her eyes widened in something close to shock. She turned to Lena, unable to speak, unable to process what she was experiencing. Lena could wait no longer. She cut into the chicken leg on her tray, feeling the crispy skin crack under her knife, hearing the sound it made, seeing the juice that ran from the tender meat inside. She lifted the fork to her mouth and bit down. The first sensation was the crunch of the seasoned coating, salty and perfectly spiced with a complexity she had never encountered in any chicken dish from home. Then came the meat itself, hot and incredibly moist, flavored all the way through with something that tasted like butter and herbs and the smoke of the cooking process. For several seconds, Lena forgot where she was. She forgot that she was a prisoner of war, forgot that the men and women serving this food were supposed to be her mortal enemies, forgot everything except the overwhelming reality of taste and texture and satisfaction. This wasn't just food. This was abundance made tangible, care translated into flavor, a direct contradiction to every single thing she had been taught about American barbarism and cruelty. Her propaganda training had prepared her for hatred, for privation, for the grinding misery of enemy captivity. It had not prepared her for fried chicken. Across from her, young Sonia had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she ate. The girl wasn't crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of experiencing kindness, where she expected cruelty, generosity, where she anticipated deprivation. Beside Sonia, another woman named Helga Fischer whispered in German, "This is what they eat? The Americans eat like this?" The question contained within it the seed of a terrible awakening, the beginning of understanding just how thoroughly they had been lied to about everything. Lena forced herself to slow down, to eat with some measure of dignity rather than the ravenous desperation she felt. But with each bite, something fundamental was shifting in her understanding of reality. She had served the Reich, believing she was protecting civilization from American decadence and cruelty. She had accepted hardship and sacrifice as necessary for a righteous cause. But what did it mean that the enemy fed their prisoners like this? What did it say about her own country that she had never eaten this well, even before the war, even in peacetime Munich, where her family had been considered comfortable, middle class? Sergeant Jackson moved from behind the serving counter, walking slowly through the mess hall, observing the German women's reactions. When he passed Lena's table, he paused, and she looked up to meet his eyes. He was the first black man she had ever seen in person. The propaganda had taught her that such men were inferior, dangerous, barely human. But looking at him now, seeing the quiet competence in his bearing, the skill evident in the meal he had prepared, she felt the propaganda cracking like the crispy skin on the chicken she had just eaten. He said something in English. She didn't understand, but his tone was neither mocking nor cruel. It sounded almost like concern, like a chef checking on whether his guests were satisfied with their meal. Lena found herself nodding, an automatic gesture of acknowledgement, and something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps that a small bridge had just been crossed. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that Lena struggled to accept as reality. Every morning brought eggs and toast, every lunch a sandwich with meat and cheese, every dinner a different American dish that challenged her understanding of what prisoners should receive. But it was the fried chicken, served every Wednesday evening, that haunted her thoughts and slowly dismantled the worldview she had carried into captivity. On the 4th Wednesday, Lena made a decision that surprised even herself. After breakfast, she approached Lieutenant Russell with a request she had practiced in her limited English. "I work kitchen. Bit. Please. I help cooking." The lieutenant studied her for a long moment, perhaps searching for ulterior motives, then nodded slowly. By afternoon, Lena found herself standing in the camp kitchen wearing an apron, facing Sergeant Roland Jackson. He regarded her with the same quiet observation she had noticed that first night. Then he gestured to the large metal bowls on the counter, to the raw chicken pieces waiting to be prepared, to the containers of flour and spices that held the secret to Wednesday's transformation. He spoke in English, slow and clear, demonstrating each step while Lena watched with an attention she had never brought to her auxiliary corps training. First came the buttermilk soak, the chicken pieces submerged in liquid she had never seen used this way. Jackson explained something about tenderness, about flavor, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Then the seasoned flour, and here he paused, meeting her eyes before opening each container of spice. Salt, black pepper, paprika, garlic, powder, onion powder, cayenne. He measured nothing, working from instinct and experience, his dark hands dusted white with flour as he mixed the coating. Lena tried to mimic his movements, her own hands clumsy at first. He corrected her gently, guiding her fingers to feel the right consistency of the coating, the proper way to ensure every inch of chicken was covered. When the pieces went into the hot oil, he showed her how to listen for the right sound, how to watch for the color change that indicated perfection. The kitchen filled with that now familiar aroma, and Lena felt something shift inside her chest. This man, whom her propaganda training had taught her to despise, was teaching her his craft with patience and respect. He treated her not as a defeated enemy or a source of cheap labor, but as someone worthy of learning something he clearly valued. When the first batch emerged golden and perfect, he nodded his approval and said something in English that she didn't need translation to understand. She had done well. As they worked side by side through the afternoon, preparing enough chicken for the entire camp, Lena found herself thinking about her mother's kitchen in Munich. She thought about the simple boiled chicken they ate on special occasions, the way her mother had apologized for not having butter or proper seasoning even before the war's privations began. She thought about abundance and scarcity, about who defined civilization and who decided which lives deserved dignity. By evening, when the German women filed into the mess hall, Lena stood behind the serving counter beside Sergeant Jackson, serving the meal she had helped create. Wednesday dinners evolved into something beyond simple meals. By December, the mess hall had transformed from a place of silent, wary eating into something that resembled community. Lena continued her kitchen work, and other German women gradually joined in various capacities, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, setting tables. The barrier between prisoner and captor blurred in ways that would have been unthinkable in the early weeks of captivity. Corporal Daniel Wright had begun sitting with some of the German women during meals, his phrasebook of German always in hand. His attempts at conversation were clumsy but sincere, and the women responded with their own broken English. On one Wednesday evening, he showed them a photograph of his family's farm in Iowa, pointing to his mother standing beside a chicken coop. "My mama makes fried chicken too," he said slowly. "Different from Sergeant Jackson's. She uses lard, not oil." Hannah, whose English had improved rapidly, translated for the others. Then, haltingly, she shared her own memory. My grandmother, she make Berthähnchen, is roasted, not fried, only for Christmas or birthday. The admission opened a floodgate. Suddenly the table was filled with women sharing memories of meals from before the war, from peacetime childhoods that now seemed impossibly distant. Sonia spoke of her mother's potato dumplings. Ingrid described the fish her father caught in the Elbe River. Sergeant Jackson, overhearing these conversations from the kitchen, emerged with a plate of leftover chicken and sat down at their table. The German women tensed momentarily, old reflexes surfacing, but he simply smiled and began to talk. Lieutenant Russell translated, her voice soft as she conveyed his words. He spoke about Louisiana, about his grandmother who had perfected this recipe during slavery, passing it down through generations as a form of resistance and dignity. Food, he explained, was how his family maintained identity when everything else was taken from them. Lena listened, understanding perhaps half the English words but grasping all of the meaning. Here was a man whose people had suffered in ways her propaganda training had never acknowledged, whose family had endured oppression her education had never mentioned, yet he had welcomed her into his kitchen, shared his grandmother's legacy, treated her with a respect she was beginning to realize she had never truly earned. Private David Kim joined them, bringing his own story of his parents' immigration from Korea, of learning to love fried chicken as a way of becoming American while maintaining their own food traditions at home. The table became a circle of stories, each person offering small pieces of themselves, building bridges with words and shared meals. Captain Foster observed from across the hall, making notes in his daily report. He would write that evening about the unexpected success of food and rehabilitation, about how fried chicken had accomplished what lectures and propaganda films never could. He would recommend similar approaches in other camps. But sitting at that table, the people involved understood something simpler and more profound. They were learning that the enemy had mothers who cooked, grandmothers who passed down recipes, families who gathered around tables and shared stories. They were learning, bite by bite, that the enemy was human. January 1945 brought the first letters from Germany. The Red Cross had finally established reliable mail routes, and 43 women gathered in the barracks as Lieutenant Russell distributed thin envelopes bearing stamps from their defeated homeland. Lena's hands shook as she recognized her mother's handwriting, the first communication she had received in 4 months. Around her, women tore open envelopes with desperate eagerness, hungry for news, for connection, for confirmation that someone they loved still existed. Lena read her mother's letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated her understanding. Her family was alive but starving. Her younger sister had lost 30 pounds. Her father had traded his watch for a loaf of bread. They were eating turnips and potato peels, standing in lines for hours for rations that barely sustained life. Her mother's handwriting grew shaky toward the end. "We are so proud you served the fatherland. We pray you will come home soon. We need you." Across the barracks, the sounds of weeping mixed with occasional exclamations of relief. Some women had received good news, confirmation that family members had survived. But most letters told the same story as Lena's, tales of privation and suffering that made the comfortable beds and regular meals of Camp Longview feel like obscene luxuries. Hannah sat on her bed, staring at her letter without speaking. When Lena asked, she simply shook her head, unable to voice whatever devastating news the paper contained. That evening, the Wednesday fried chicken dinner felt different. Lena stood in the kitchen beside Sergeant Jackson, preparing the meal as she had done for weeks now, but the familiar motions brought no comfort. She thought about her sister's hollow cheeks, about her father trading his father's watch for bread, about her mother's shaking hands forming those words. She looked down at the abundance before her, at the chicken pieces waiting to be transformed into golden perfection, at the containers of spices and flour and buttermilk, and felt a crushing weight of guilt settle over her shoulders. When the women filed into the mess hall, the usual conversation was absent. They ate mechanically, tasting nothing, their thoughts thousands of miles away in a Germany that was collapsing, while they sat in enemy captivity, eating better than they ever had in peacetime. Young Sonia pushed her tray away after 2 bites, tears streaming down her face. "My brother is dead," she whispered in German. "Killed in January. They buried him in a mass grave." There was no funeral. Ingrid reached across the table to grip the girl's hand, but even the older woman's composure had cracked. Her letter had brought news that Hamburg lay in ruins, that the hospital where she trained had been destroyed in firebombing, that her entire neighborhood was simply gone, erased from existence. The women who had been laughing and sharing stories just days earlier now sat in silence, confronting an impossible question. How could they justify their comfort while their families suffered? How could they eat this generous food while people they loved were starving? Lena caught Sergeant Jackson watching from the kitchen, his expression understanding something she couldn't articulate. He had seen this transformation before, she realized. He knew what news from home could do. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war was over, and Camp Longview filled with celebrations that the German women watched from behind their barracks windows. American soldiers cheered, music played from radios, and the future suddenly became immediate and unavoidable. Within days, Captain Foster received orders from Washington regarding repatriation procedures. The 43 German women would be returned to their homeland within 6 weeks. The announcement should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it brought paralyzing uncertainty. Lena sat on her bed that evening, her mother's letters spread before her, 5 months of correspondence documenting a Germany that bore no resemblance to the country she had left. The latest letter described her family living in a single room of their bombed house, sharing space with 2 other displaced families. Food remained scarce. Work was impossible to find. Her mother's tone had shifted from desperate to simply exhausted. Hannah lay on the next bed, staring at the ceiling. "What are we going home to?" she asked quietly in German. It was the question they had all been avoiding, the thought that kept them awake despite their comfortable mattresses and full stomachs. Across the barracks, similar conversations unfolded in hushed tones. Ingrid spoke with 3 other women about Hamburg's destruction. Sonia, who had lost her brother and learned her father was missing, wondered aloud if anyone remained to welcome her return. That Wednesday, the kitchen felt different. Lena prepared the fried chicken with Sergeant Jackson in what had become their comfortable routine, but every motion carried the weight of impermanence. In 6 weeks, she would never make this recipe again. She would return to a Germany where chicken of any kind was a fantasy, where the spices and abundance she had learned to work with simply didn't exist. She would return to starvation, to ruins, to a country that would view her captivity as failure and shame. Sergeant Jackson seemed to sense her turmoil. As they worked, he spoke slowly in English, knowing she understood more now after months of kitchen conversations. "My grandmother," he said, "she always told me that food is dignity. When they took everything else from our people, we kept our recipes, our ways of preparing meals. That was resistance. That was survival." He paused, coating another chicken piece with careful precision. "You learned this now. Nobody can take that from you." But Lena wasn't sure that was true. What good was knowing how to make fried chicken in a country with no chickens, no oil, no spices, no hope? She had found something in this camp beyond cooking skills. She had found respect, purposeful work, the possibility of redemption through learning and contribution. She had discovered that the enemy possessed a humanity her propaganda training had denied, and in that discovery, she had lost the certainty of who she was and where she belonged. That evening, as the women gathered for what might be one of their last Wednesday dinners together, Lena looked around the mess hall and realized something terrifying. This place, this enemy prison camp in Texas, felt more like home than the idea of returning to Munich. The chicken on her tray represented everything she would lose. June 15, 1945. Captain Foster called a mandatory assembly for all German prisoners to finalize repatriation procedures. The 43 women, gathered in the mess hall, dressed in the clean civilian clothes the Red Cross had provided to replace their worn auxiliary uniforms. Transport would depart in 1 week. They would travel by train to New York, then by ship to Bremen, then into whatever remained of Germany. The captain spoke with bureaucratic efficiency, outlining schedules and procedures, treating their departure as an administrative necessity rather than a human crossroads. Lena sat beside Hannah, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench. Around her, some women nodded with resignation, accepting the inevitable. Others stared straight ahead with expressions of barely contained dread. When Captain Foster finished his announcement and asked if there were questions, silence filled the hall. No one moved, no one spoke. The moment stretched into uncomfortable stillness. Then Lena stood up. She hadn't planned to. She hadn't decided in any conscious way that this was her moment to speak. But her body moved before her. The mind could stop it, rising from the bench with a momentum that felt beyond her control. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. Captain Foster looked surprised. Lieutenant Russell's expression shifted to concern. Sergeant Jackson, standing near the kitchen entrance, watched with that same quiet attention he had shown since her first day in his kitchen. "Captain Foster," Lena said in careful English, each word precisely formed from months of practice. "May I speak for some of us?" Her voice wavered but held. The captain hesitated, then nodded slowly. Lena felt Hannah's hand briefly touch her arm in support before she continued. "We have been talking, some of us. Many of us." She paused, searching for words that could convey the impossible thing she was about to request. "We do not wish to return to Germany. Not now. Maybe not ever." The statement landed like a physical blow. Captain Foster's expression transformed from bureaucratic efficiency to complete confusion. Lieutenant Russell stood up from her seat, her mouth opening but no words emerging. Even the American soldiers lining the walls exchanged startled glances. Prisoners of war didn't refuse repatriation. That wasn't how this worked. That wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. Hannah stood beside Lena, her movement decisive. Then Ingrid rose from her seat at the back of the hall, her nurse's composure masking whatever turmoil she felt inside. Sonia stood, tears already streaming down her young face. One by one, 17 women rose from their seats, creating a silent visual testimony to the impossible choice they were making. They stood scattered throughout the hall, united not by formation but by shared understanding of what they were rejecting and what they were desperately hoping to claim. "We have nothing to go back to," Lena continued, her English breaking slightly under the emotion. "Our families are scattered, our cities are ruins. But here we have found something. Dignity. Purpose. A chance to become better than what we were." She gestured toward Sergeant Jackson. "This man, you taught us he was inferior, but he taught me his grandmother's recipe. He treated me with respect I never earned." 25 years later, on a warm Texas evening in 1970, Lena Schneider stood in the kitchen of her restaurant in downtown Houston. The sign outside read Lena's Kitchen, German and American cuisine, and inside, the dinner rush was in full swing. Her staff moved with practiced efficiency, preparing schnitzel alongside fried chicken, potato dumplings next to mashed potatoes with gravy. The menu represented two worlds that Lena had learned didn't need to remain separate, two cultures that could coexist on the same plate, in the same heart. She was now 49 years old, an American citizen for 18 years, a business owner for 12. Her English carried only the slightest accent, a musical quality that customers found charming. She had married a Houston contractor named Robert, raised two children who spoke English as their first language and German as their heritage. Her mother had eventually joined her in America in 1952, living long enough to see her daughter's restaurant succeed before passing peacefully 5 years ago. But every Wednesday, Lena still made fried chicken, using the recipe Sergeant Roland Jackson had taught her in that prison camp kitchen a quarter-century earlier. He had passed away in 1963, but his grandson had visited the restaurant last year, bringing his own children to taste the recipe his great-grandmother had created during slavery and his grandfather had shared with a former enemy. They had wept together over that meal, understanding that food carried history and healing in equal measure. Of the 17 women who had chosen to stay in 1945, 14 had successfully immigrated. The process had taken years of paperwork, sponsorships, and bureaucratic battles. Captain Foster had fought for them, Lieutenant Russell had advocated tirelessly, and Mrs. Helen Martinez had organized a coalition of Texas families willing to sponsor German war prisoners. The unprecedented nature of their request had eventually reached newspapers, sparking national debate about redemption, forgiveness, and what it meant to be American. Hannah owned a bakery 3 blocks away, her German pastries as popular as her American pies. Ingrid had become a registered nurse at Houston General Hospital, training a generation of young nurses in both medical skill and human compassion. Sonia had married an Army veteran and taught German at the local high school, ensuring that language and culture survived even as enmity faded. Tonight, Lena's restaurant hosted a special gathering. Former prisoners and former guards, now simply friends, gathered around tables to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. They were older now, grayer, marked by time and life. But when Lena brought out platters of golden fried chicken, the same recipe that had changed everything, the years fell away. She stood before them and raised her glass. "To Sergeant Jackson," she said, her voice carrying through the restaurant, "who taught us that dignity tastes like fried chicken, and that the greatest victory is choosing love over hate." Around the tables in English and German, voices joined together. "To Sergeant Jackson." Outside, Houston's traffic hummed with the sound of a city built by people from everywhere, including former enemies who had learned to break bread together.